Russian President Vladimir Putin will keep driving the war forward, wider and deeper. That's the stark message that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy delivered while speaking at the UN General Assembly in New York. Russia, he claims, has its sights set beyond Ukraine. If Ukraine falls, the rest of Europe is next on Putin's agenda. Zelenskyy's final warning at the UN is clear: stop Putin now, or your country is next. On September 24th, the BBC provided a breakdown of Zelenskyy's UN speech, noting that he claimed that Russia would expand its campaign of aggression deeper into Europe if it were victorious in Ukraine. The key to preventing this from happening is twofold, Zelenskyy says: present a united front and ramp up support for Ukraine. To the latter point, Zelenskyy is clearly wary about the rollercoaster Ukraine has been riding with the US throughout the course of 2025. As he gave his speech, Zelenskyy would have been mindful that this relationship can turn in an instant. Right now, Ukraine enjoys the support from the US, perhaps more so than at any point during the year. However, it was only back in March when the US made a short-lived decision to cut off military aid and intelligence sharing to Ukraine in what, in hindsight, appears to have been a move to convince Zelenskyy to begin negotiating a ceasefire. There has also been faltering support from Ukraine's other partners in the West. Though the European Union or EU is steadfast in its backing of Ukraine, it was also in March that Italy and Spain declared that they weren't ready to back a $43.6 billion pledge to Ukraine, amidst concerns related to their own well-being. That brings us back to Zelenskyy's point about creating a united front. He knows that Russia thrives on division. The fact that so many nations are providing support to Ukraine also gives rise to bureaucratic wrangling, as we saw within the EU in March. All of this needs to stop, Zelenskyy declares. A united front is needed, meaning NATO and the EU must coordinate their responses to Russia, with Ukraine at their side, to show Putin that Europe isn't going to back down to Russia's threats. Or perhaps more importantly from Zelenskyy's point of view, that Europe is going to support Ukraine wholeheartedly as it defends itself against Russia. It has to, Zelenskyy says, because Putin isn't going to stop at Ukraine. The very countries that may be wary of offering support now could be the same countries into which Russian forces march in the future. Interestingly, Zelenskyy then moved on to talk about the threat of artificial intelligence or AI in a war setting. It's only a matter of time, not much, before drones are fighting drones, attacking critical infrastructure and targeting people all by themselves, fully autonomous and no human involved, except the few who control AI systems, Ukraine's president declared. It's a good point, made all the more interesting by the fact that Ukraine itself is one of the frontrunners when it comes to introducing AI into drones and other weapons. In March 2025, the Center for Strategic and International Studies reported that Ukraine had approved the purchase of 10,000 AI-enhanced drones. The organization called this a preliminary yet significant step toward broader adoption of advanced autonomous systems. In July, United 24 Media reported on the world's first footage of the TFL-1 drone in action. Created by a Ukrainian company called the Fourth Law, the drone uses AI to allow it to strike targets independent of an operator's control, making it resistant to electronic warfare. And on September 24th, Time magazine wrote a piece in which it said Ukraine has gamified drone warfare, highlighting the case of the most recent versions of Ukraine's infamous Vampire drone. The new versions of this drone allow Ukraine's drone operators to activate a special AI mode mid-flight, allowing the drone to operate without direct control. The Vampire doesn't yet have autonomous targeting, but it could have. The Times says that the drone's developer, who wishes to remain anonymous, says, "We have the technology." That suggests it's only a case of Ukraine giving the go-ahead for hordes of AI-powered drones to start tearing through Russia's front lines, all while operators can keep themselves at a safe distance. The point we're making here is that it seems a little strange, perhaps even hypocritical, to see Zelenskyy saying that there needs to be rules on a technology that Ukraine is so ably using. But perhaps we can see this from another perspective. Maybe Zelenskyy is calling for rules to be established now because he sees, more directly than most, just how devastating AI could become if Russia expands its war beyond Ukraine and into the rest of Europe. Again, it's a case of act now or regret it later. If AI isn't brought under control while it's still in its relative infancy, Russia may find ways to use it that are far more devastating than anything Ukraine is doing. There is already much debate about the role AI currently plays and is going to play in the future in warfare. Carlos Bataillas argues that the use of AI puts into question the ability of existing legal frameworks to govern such technology. While AI may seem relatively harmless when used as an analytical tool that enables faster decision-making, as often seen within the intelligence community, its introduction onto the battlefield is a serious concern. Unlike AI decision support systems, which support human decision-making, autonomous weapon systems can select and engage targets without human intervention once activated. This autonomy in critical functions raises unique ethical and legal concerns, prompting debates about their compatibility with international humanitarian law principles, Bataillas writes. It's this autonomy that's the main concern. If a human uses a weapon to shoot a civilian, that human can be prosecuted. They've committed a war crime and will be punished for it. But what happens if it's a drone operating autonomously thanks to an AI algorithm? Who gets prosecuted then? Can it be argued that nobody should be prosecuted because the drone isn't being operated by a person? Or is it the drone's developers who should be punished? The country that's using it, perhaps? Writing for the Regulatory Review, Gianna Hill builds on these ethical quandaries. Hill cites a paper written by Stockholm University's Mark Klamberg, writing, Klamberg identifies concerns that the use of AI is more likely to endanger civilians, marks a loss of humanity, and may facilitate biased decision-making. AI may also increase the power asymmetry between nations, creating the potential for riskless warfare where one side is too advanced to fail. These types of ethical quandaries are now just starting to arise as AI usage in warfare becomes prominent in Ukraine. Zelensky's warning when it comes to AI is that Russia will happily operate in a world where there are no rules on the technology. Fewer rules means fewer limitations, and Russia will engage in a massive arms race with anybody who attempts to get ahead of it when it's taking part in an active war. We'll come back to that point about an arms race later in the video. For now, we'll return to Zelensky's comments. Ukraine's president also used his time on the UN stage to warn that international institutions are too weak in their dealings with Russia and countries like it. In a brave move considering where he was speaking, Zelensky noted that the UN hadn't done enough to prevent war all over the world. Ukraine is the obvious example. However, Zelensky also brought up the recent fighting in Gaza, Syria, and Sudan, using all as examples of how the institutions created to prevent these types of conflicts from happening aren't doing their jobs. In particular, the likes of the UN aren't able to offer countries like Ukraine any security guarantee. But then, as the BBC notes, Zelensky's too weak comments may also have been made in reference to NATO. After all, Zelensky said that a country being part of NATO doesn't automatically mean you are safe, in a statement that is clearly intended to ruffle the feathers of those Ukraine believes may be taking Russia's actions too lightly. It's not that Zelensky is saying that NATO isn't powerful enough to offer security guarantees. It's that NATO is stopping short of doing so because it's still too scared of pushing Putin into escalating his war. The problem with this approach from Zelensky's perspective is that Russia is already escalating. Russia has been sending drones and fighter jets into airspace owned by NATO members throughout September, in what seems to be both a deliberate provocation and an attempt by Putin to test NATO's boundaries. Debate has raged following these incidents, which have affected Poland, Romania, and Estonia, among others, and there are now calls for NATO nations to be able to shoot down any Russian assets that enter their airspace. But calls aren't enough. Action is needed, Zelensky argues. That's how weak these institutions have become, Ukraine's president said. For decades, just statements and statements. Without action, his warning seems to be, Russia will only grow bolder in its attempts to intimidate NATO members. In particular, Putin could target what he sees as weaker NATO nations on the eastern flank, such as the Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. This isn't Russia playing games. What it's doing across NATO's eastern flank is committing acts of hybrid warfare, because Putin is wholly confident that NATO won't do anything about it other than condemn. Perhaps Zelensky's point here is that international institutions spend too much time debating and not enough time acting. Direct security guarantees provided to Ukraine would show Putin exactly where these institutions stand, in addition to serving as a barrier preventing what Zelensky warns is coming. Remember that Ukraine's president said that Putin will keep driving the war forward, wider and deeper. His warning can't get any clearer than that. The problem, as several outlets have claimed, is that there's still no real solutions when it comes to what a security guarantee for Ukraine could or should look like. Right now, NATO's allies are working under the assumption that a guarantee could only exist once the war ends. They presume that the end will come as a result of a peace agreement. However, that presumption doesn't seem to reflect reality, as Putin has made it clear that any peace agreement would have to be made on terms that Ukraine will never accept. Even assuming peace is somehow declared, Europe has no real solutions on how it would provide a security guarantee, Politico said in August. Sure, there is now the coalition of the willing that says it will offer whatever is needed for a security guarantee to be successful. Commissions are being led and conversations are ongoing, however no concrete answers about what a security guarantee will look like are forthcoming. There's an obvious solution, Politico says, allowing Ukraine to join NATO so that it's protected by Article 5 of the NATO Charter. However, that's already been ruled out not only by Russia, but as Politico points out, the US and some of NATO's European partners. And that comes right back to the point Zelensky is making about the weakness of international institutions. If NATO wishes to project power against Russia, which Zelensky says it needs to do to prevent Putin from coming for NATO nations next, then why won't it accept Ukraine? Doing so would force Putin to think long and hard about whether he continues his war. Ukraine being a NATO member would mean that any further aggression brings more than just military aid. Under Article 5, every NATO member would come to the direct aid of Ukraine, sparking a massive war that is bigger than the one even Putin wants to create. But right now, that isn't happening. As the conversation noted in August, there is now a security guarantee paradox. Any guarantee that's too weak won't do enough to deter Russia, meaning Putin will continue to set his sights beyond Ukraine. But a stronger security guarantee would anger Russia to the point where it won't accept the proposal as part of a peace deal. A strong guarantee, such as Ukraine joining NATO, would essentially be an act of force rather than of compromise. An act that Zelenskyy seems to argue is needed, both to protect Ukraine and to guard against future wars between European nations and Russia. So far, we see several points made by Zelenskyy, all of which come back to his main point about how other countries will be next if Russia isn't stopped in Ukraine. Uncertain support combined with a lack of a united front gives Russia the opportunity to continue its war, which presents a risk to other countries in the future. The rise of AI is dangerous without regulation, even as Ukraine benefits from it, because it could lead to an era of dehumanized warfare that Russia would take advantage of. And when it comes to international institutions, Zelenskyy is arguing that they do too much talking without taking action. It's that lack of action that gives Putin the confidence to do things like sending drones into Polish airspace. And in the future, Russia's leader may believe that the seeming weakness of institutions like the UN and NATO will afford him the opportunity to move his war beyond Ukraine. Next, let's come back to the point we mentioned earlier in the video about the Ukraine war arms race. We are now living through the most destructive arms race in human history, Zelenskyy declared during his UN speech. This is debatable. It could be argued that the Cold War arms race, in which the US and Russia competed against each other to build massive nuclear arsenals, was more destructive. At the peak of the Cold War arms race, the US had about 30,000 nukes and the former Soviet Union had around 40,000, Reuters says. However, none of those nuclear weapons was ever used, though they could be in the future. What the Ukraine war has given us is the rise of drone warfare. According to Forbes, Ukraine is aiming to build 4.5 million drones in 2025 alone. The same outlet notes that Russia's target is between 3 and 4 million drones. This is the same arms race to which Zelenskyy is referring, and he's right that it could end up being the most destructive in history, if it isn't already. Drones are now responsible for around 70% of the casualties in the Ukraine war, and that number is likely to climb higher as both nations become more reliant on unmanned vehicles. Then add AI into the mix as we discussed earlier. If a nation wants peace, it still has to work on weapons. It's sick, but that's the reality, Zelenskyy said during his speech. Not international law, not cooperation, weapons decide who survives. Zelenskyy then brings up a potential future that will have any nation that might be next on Putin's agenda feeling worried, using it as an argument for why the West needs to step up now to stop the Ukraine war. Stopping this war now and within the global arms race is cheaper than building underground kindergartens or massive bunkers for critical infrastructure later, Zelenskyy said, before moving on to the most worrying part of his statement. Stopping Russia now is cheaper than wondering who will be the first to create a simple drone carrying a nuclear warhead. On cost alone, Zelenskyy may have a point. In February, Bruegel argued that Europe might need 300,000 more soldiers and annual combined defense spending to reach at least 250 billion euros, or at least $293 billion to deter Russia. That might only be the starting point. Add the building of bunkers and everything else that Zelenskyy mentions to that list, plus being caught up in an arms race and costs will balloon. This is a pragmatic argument being put forth by Zelenskyy that comes back to his main point that the West needs to do something about Russia now, or it will regret its inaction in the future. The warnings about drones carrying nuclear warheads is Zelenskyy's way of really driving the point home. The US, at least, wouldn't be threatened by these types of drones, not until their range and speed are improved, but Europe, what's to say that Russia isn't working on this sort of technology, given that it maintains a nuclear stockpile of 4,380 nuclear warheads, per the Arms Control Association. Zelenskyy is painting a picture of a future in which Russia, untethered by international law and allowed to complete its invasion of Ukraine, will use what it's already learned about drones to become an even bigger threat than ever before. Perhaps it's not a conventional war with Russia that Europe has to worry about. The threat of nuclear war, powered by an AI-controlled drone army, could be in the continent's future if Russia isn't stopped now, Zelenskyy appears to be implying. If those nations to which Russia is becoming an ever larger threat still weren't getting the point, Zelenskyy drives it all home with the most direct statement of the speech. Ukraine is only the first, and now Russian drones are already flying across Europe, and Russian operations are already spreading across countries, and Putin wants to continue this war by expanding it, Zelenskyy claimed. It's difficult to argue against him. As for where Europe should focus its immediate efforts outside of providing more support to Ukraine, Zelenskyy offers an answer: Moldova. Europe cannot afford to lose Moldova too, Zelenskyy said of a country that seems to be at the most direct risk of a Russian invasion in the future. As Al Jazeera notes, Russian forces are already deployed in Moldova's breakaway region of Transnistria. Moldova itself is a small country of only 2.3 million people. That stature would make it the perfect target for Putin, potentially leading to Moldova being pulled into Russia's orbit in much the same way as Belarus and Georgia have been. For Europe, supporting Moldova's stability is not costly, but failing to do so will come at a much higher price, Zelenskyy adds. That's why the EU needs to help Moldova now with funding and energy support, not just words or political gestures. Russia is already active in Moldova. It hasn't invaded yet, but Russia's influence is already felt throughout the country. On September 23rd, the country's president, Maia Sandu, warned that both her country's independence and Europe's future are under threat due to Russia's actions. She accused Russia of pouring hundreds of millions of euros into Moldova to spread disinformation, violence and fear. The Kremlin believes that we are all for sale, that we are all too small to resist, that we are not a country, only a territory, Sandu declared. And though she may be implying that Moldova isn't too small to resist Russia, would that really be the case if Putin's campaign of influence fails and he turns instead to a direct invasion? Moldova would fall without support. Ukraine will do the same. Ultimately, Zelenskyy is warning that Europe can't allow a domino effect to occur. Each territory that the continent fails to protect now is territory that may be used against it in the future. Your country may be next, Ukraine's president warns, and only stopping Putin now will prevent a much larger war in the future. One bright spot in all of this is that Europe appears to be somewhat heeding Zelenskyy's words. One of the EU's calls for action is on the verge of becoming a reality, as the continent works on creating a drone wall that would stop Russia in its tracks. Putin thought Europe was weak, it just blew up in his face. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more videos covering the tensions rising between Russia and the European countries that stand against it. And thank you as always for watching.